And welcome to our Climate Action for Associations Digital Breakfast. Pleased to be joining you this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's session. It's obviously, there's no live viewing of the session currently. We are recording it specifically because obviously if we get into some really interesting conversation that will inspire and inform other associations and help them on their journey, then that's fantastic. That's the ultimate intention behind these discussions, is to convene and learn and share with one another. So this morning I am delighted to be joined by Francesca Sharp from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Francesca is Technical Lead of Climate Change, which is fantastic. Thank you for joining us. And Andrew Cruddington, who is Climate Change Associate at the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation. Due to join us, hopefully shortly, is Ben Wilmot, who is Head of Public Policy at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And as always, our co-chairs, Nick Gowing and Chris Langdon from Thinking the Unthinkable, who are always fantastic chairs and great at inspiring new thinking and debate and discussion in this area. What I'm really keen to achieve in 59 minutes, or 58 minutes now, I should say, is to glean into some of the great work that both of you are doing within your institutes to guide and support the membership that obviously you represent. And if you haven't got too far on your journey yet, what plans you've got in place, what ideas you've got in place to obviously help your sector profession hit the net zero, the urgent net zero targets, obviously, that it needs to meet over the next 8 and a bit years. So I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to get the conversation started.
Thanks, Ali, and good morning, everybody, again. And Chris and I will be doing this together. Just to give you a little bit of background and make it clear, there's no speeches. This is a discussion. It's a conversation. So jump in, disagree, take issue with us or with each other, because we want this to be an enlightened progress, working towards the enormity of what has to be done here. Let me just show you, I'll just tell you what part of my light has fallen off. That I'm putting it up there, not really to advertise, but to show the work that we've been doing, showing the difficulty here of leaders finding their way forward in times of difficulty. My camera keeps going off here.
Don't worry, Nick. I shared the book while you were off camera.
I tell you what, while I just fix something here, something's just fallen off the camera. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Well, Nick and I have been working on Thinking the Unthinkable for the last 6 years. We wrote the book 3 years ago, looking at why leaders find it so difficult to change. And a lot of our work lately is focusing on how leaders and everybody essentially grasp the essentials of what needs to do on net zero. We're very excited to have 2 institutions who are at the critical stage of that process. I have another book here, which I know is a title that you've used yourself, Francesca, your colleagues, 6 Capitals, or Can Accountants Save the Planet? I mean, there's been a lot of talk, and I think it's very informed thought about the six capitals, the role of accountancy, the new financial metrics, I think is a really important thing. And obviously you and your colleagues have been at the forefront of that. And Andrew, on your latest blog, talking to your colleagues in the transport world, you say, if you haven't grasped net zero, you should be worried. Yeah. And you explain how important the actions to be taken by your sector is going to be over the next few years. So we're really delighted to have you with us, in the sense you are at the cutting edge of advocating change in 2 critical sectors of the economy, globally as well as nationally. So that's why we'd really like to hear from you the way you think it's possible to, with the help of all your members, because the great joy of working with associations, institutions, is that you have all those networks and contacts. So you have huge levers you can pull potentially. So why don't you, Nick, ask the opening question?
Yeah, and maybe just to build, your blog says, if I asked what does net zero mean for you professionally, what would you reply? If the answer is, well, to be honest, not much, you should be worried. And certainly our perspective is very much that, and that's what CAFA is about. The fact that at COP26, there are 5 million SMEs who have still not got their brains around the enormity of what is happening. And as well, Francesca, can we just ask you to talk about, I picked up from your website, I couldn't print it in color, and it's difficult with this thing, but you can see, are you professionally ready for climate change? And reading through that, particularly what you talk about later on, when you have a section on SMEs, getting ready is a professional imperative. So in the next 50 minutes or so, what we're trying to do is cull from you where the cutting edge is, where the frustrations are, not just for the institution, but also among your colleagues, your members, the mindsets. In other words, the people you're dealing with. And Francesca, maybe you could just pick up on this. Are you making progress? Because obviously you talk about the first major professional body to announce its carbon neutrality, but you've still got to change the mindsets. You've still got to adapt the mindsets. Are you making progress? Because we'd like to know how much what you're doing can be an example to other associations and other members of CAFA.
That is the $1 million question, Nick, because it should link in with my PDR, which is, am I doing my job? Is it cutting through? And it's interesting that you picked up on our climate hub there that we titled, "Are you professionally ready for climate change?" That was something we launched back in around 2019. And 2019 was obviously the year that we saw London growing to a halt with the Extinction Rebellion activities. We also saw the school strikes for climate, and a phenomenal year, I think, at really accelerating the perspective of perhaps mainstream views around climate change. There was a report earlier this year that actually, climate deniers don't really exist too much anymore. They are really on the fringes, and the majority of people now believe that climate is an emergency that action needs to be taken urgently. It's interesting reflecting on that language that we used, "Are you professionally ready?" It's been quite an accelerator of itself. And indeed, people think that we maybe could go further and say, "Are you professionally competent to deal with the impacts of climate change?" With the likes of Mark Carney saying that every single financial decision needs to take climate change into account. For us and our very diverse membership, that's about making it relevant to all of our members, whether they are, we've got members who are at the heart of the climate debate. Alok Sharma, the COP president, is an ICAEW member, chartered accountant.
Well, he was.
So is Andrew Griffiths, who is leading the net zero business movement. And Anne-Marie Trevelyan was speaking on a webinar for us yesterday around the role that adaptation and resilience will play in kind of our climate journey. But that said, we have to make it accessible to the ordinary man on the street.
Can I just pick up there, because you talk about committed to enabling our membership and the broader profession to respond to these challenges. And I think that's where the CAFA experience is so important, to work out whether you're succeeding in doing that within your own organisation.
Absolutely. Our membership, we tout them as trusted business advisors in the UK. We estimate they advise 3 million businesses. And that could be, your jobbing accountant that has practice above on a high street, right through to the big four accountancy firms. And of course, the reach that they have is huge, but are they having it with all the conversations with clients they have?
And what's your answer?
Whether we're doing it or not?
Whether you're succeeding. And we should say hello to Ben, who I think is joining us. Ben, welcome.
I describe myself as a relentless optimist, so I think we are. I think our membership has never been more engaged on climate. Certainly, I've never been busier, but equally, it's going to be visible in the numbers. Are we actually meeting the targets? Are we seeing realistic net zero commitments? Then are we holding people to account for those commitments? Because that's where I think the accountancy profession has a huge role to play.
And quickly, we ought to welcome Ben. Ben, you haven't missed very much, but what we decided to do is get going. And we've got literally to the top of the hour. and Francesca from the ICAEW. I was just asking her about what changes they've managed to make. Are you professionally ready for climate change? Is there documentation? Because what we're trying to do is make a conversation here. So you've dropped into the conversation, so don't feel you've missed an enormous amount, but we'll keep going, and we'll go to Andrew in a moment. But Francesca, just quickly, do you reckon you are changing minds or not? Because there are so many accountants and so many in your profession who frankly think that this is for another day.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that we have 6 generations in the workforce currently. A number of those generations are coming into the profession and joining it with this mindset already. As you say, there are the challenges about a mindset change potentially at the more senior levels within organisations. We work with groups like Chapter Zero, who have been really unlocking the opportunities around climate at board level.
And has that been working with Chapter Zero?
The membership has grown significally of those, demonstrating that I think boards are starting to take this seriously. And obviously commitment to TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has forced that, particularly in the UK, where that's going to be made mandatory by 2022 for all large listed companies. So these initiatives are getting things moving. That said, I think we need to see a lot more people treating this seriously in terms of the personal skill sets that they have, not appointing just one person at board level to be responsible, and usually that's a non-executive director, but actually having it on the board agenda every single conversation that you have. It shouldn't be a board meeting, it needs to be all board meetings, because the transition, particularly for some sectors, is going to be pretty rocky, and they need to be thinking through not just the next quarter, but the next quarter century.
All right. Well, look, stand by, because we want to keep pushing that forward. Let me go to Andrew. Andrew, just pick up on what you wrote on the 1st of April. Obviously, not everyone's seen it, but
I can remember.
But particularly what you're saying, all parts of the sector have to develop a consensus on the practical deliverable steps to get the whole sector on the path to net zero. Do you reckon you're changing mindsets or not? Because what we're trying to communicate to Ali and Em from CAFA is where there's an enormous opportunity. And certainly talking to COP26 last week, one of the senior people there, they are pretty desperate that there are vast numbers of organizations, small and large and medium size, who simply don't get it, don't want to engage, but they need to, and they can't wait several years. Andrew.
So, I mean, I'll start with the caveat that I've been in post for about 2.5 months. So everything I say, I guess, is a snapshot of what I've seen.
Everything is moving very fast.
Everything is moving very quickly. But the way I think probably the kind of big challenge that I see is that at an individual level, most transportation professionals get it, at least on a basic level. Partly because we're in the eye of the storm now. The biggest single sources of emissions are either tailpipe emissions from vehicles or from kind of construction and manufacturing, which obviously in the infrastructure, construction and maintenance side we're implicated in. So we kind of get it in principle. And I recognise what Francesca says about the kind of 6 generations in the workplace and attitudes varying quite a bit from generation to generation. Although of course there are leaders in all of those generations as well. I guess the big challenge I'm trying to get my head around is that those good intentions of both individuals and actually corporately, be it in a kind of construction client or an infrastructure asset owner, they are getting lost in a kind of sort of valley of death. So there are good intentions, there are good policy. If there's good policy coming from a Highways England and a Network Rail, and you are seeing pockets of good practice, but it's not consistent. And the kind of complaint I hear from individual members over and over again is that somehow in the procurement process or inability to kind of bring through innovative design practice or use new materials, somehow in that kind of bureaucratic sludge, the good intentions are getting lost. And I guess the challenge for us as a professional body is how can we use the levers we have? We're obviously individual membership organisations, but we do have sort of leadership. A leadership role in the sector, tremendous goodwill and a certain amount of moral authority. And I'm trying to understand how we kind of use that to work with all of those stakeholders to kind of cut through that sludge, destroy the valley of death. I keep mixing my metaphors terribly there, but we need to find some way of ensuring that those good intentions, those good kind of policy commitments can be transferred into into kind of practical action, which I think was what I was driving at in the blog, really.
Andrew, what sludge, valley of death. But why are good intentions getting lost, given the absolute provable evidence of the imperative for transportation to radically reform itself, even with all the investment issues?
Yeah, I guess there are multiple drivers. So, I've had sort of many conversations around, well, we need to decarbonize, but we need to do it in an economically sustainable way. Coming out of COVID, job creation is an imperative. So, clearly those kind of multiple objectives are in play, and that's always the case of any kind of large change program. I think at the kind of micro level as well, a lot of what we do kind of hits at a local level. It's quite difficult for local councils, local representatives as well, to kind of have a challenge of dealing with their electorates. So, we've seen this with low traffic neighbourhoods. A lot of authorities are taking the opportunity of COVID to introduce low traffic neighbourhoods, and they have been pretty controversial. Many of them have been taken out because people revolt against losing their parking spaces, for instance, or people revolt against losing road space being dedicated to things other than the car. So there's a kind of, again, this is the kind of personal behaviour piece as well. Perhaps that's an elephant in the room that we can touch on. How can we as professionals get beyond that?
Before we go to Ben, let me quote back to you what you've written. Yeah. We are now the front line of the decarbonisation challenge. And while there's been progress from the power sector, that's only one source. There are two other big single sources, and progress has been very slow. I think what Ali and Em are trying to do is work out with CAFA how to make that progress much faster. Ben, then we'll come to you and Chris. Andrew, how do you make the progress faster? That's the challenge, even after 2.5 months.
Yeah. I mean, I from a CIHT perspective, I think it's about a kind of same balance between kind of ambition, which is adequate to the scale of the challenges which you've laid out, and kind of realism about what we can take on, and what we can affect. So in my mind, I've got a kind of classic Boston box, the 2x2 box of, with high impact on decarbonisation, CIHT ability to influence, and what 4 or 5 things go in there first. Because if we try and as of any kind of change program, if we try and boil the ocean, we're not going to get there. So what I'm trying to understand is is it something in kind of standard procurement models? Is it something in, I don't know, how we bring new materials through into practice, and what can we specifically and practically do to unblock some of those pieces? Because I think the kind of time for the big rhetorical statement may have gone. I'm sure there's still hearts and minds stuff to be done, but I'd like to get down to kind of some quite specific actions. Okay,
well, Ben, let's come to you. Sorry.
So I was going to say, I think some of those are in areas around kind of the way kind of clients set up and deliver infrastructure projects is a big area for me, for instance.
I was very struck watching 2 days of the Biden summit last week. The real urgency now. We know the science, but there was a real public imperative that we've got to halve our emissions within 6 or 7 years, essentially. And that is beyond the perception of almost every member of the public, and including many organizations like your own. They can't believe it's that enormous. So, Ben, I hope you've picked up the thread of the discussion so far. Please disagree or
no,
don't
not at all.
rely on me.
Really interesting. I mean, I think from an HR perspective, of course for most other professional associations, we have been completely overtaken by the pandemic and providing information. So CIPD's priority has been providing information, advice and support to help our members deal with things like the sort of whole scale shift to home working, to how you manage furlough, the safe return to the workplace. That's been all encompassing, but I think there are opportunities coming out of the crisis. And you might well have touched on that already, around the very significant ongoing shift to more home and hybrid ways of working. Because I think HR typically has been quite tactical on this agenda, and probably looking at things like, green travel to supporting green travel to work policies, or working with facilities management to try and make incremental changes to energy efficiency within the office or workspace environment. But actually, I think if you look at the opportunities around virtual, whether it's recruitment and making sure that candidates don't have to travel to interview necessarily, they're able to many people be able to live much further away from the workplace, travel much less frequently. Learning and development is now increasingly happening digitally. So there's a whole range of opportunities from a tactical perspective. Initially, if we just start with that, I think one of the challenges, we're still getting some pressure from bits of government to try and return to some sort of what would be seen as sort of normality, because of the sort of concern around town and city centre economies. And I think that's something that needs to be really addressed, and there needs to be a real understanding of the big picture here. Can I,
Ben, picking up on that, can I be very blunt and say, do you think the HR profession is broad-minded enough to understand that it has a massive role to play when it comes to mindset, thinking, the way members of staff are performing, how they view what they've got to do, like in the finance sector? But what you're seeing is what you're seeing among chief risk officers, for example.
But I mean, to be honest, is that really happening in the finance sector?
Not yet.
I think. I mean, certainly it's definitely not happening within HR and people management. That's not. I think it's certainly not a strategic priority. In too many instances, and where it does happen, it's tactical. So I think there's a big issue around integrating this agenda into existing priorities, and there's real opportunity to do that, because I think what I've been talking about is a key way of doing that. So making sure that the recovery, building back better, is about creating more environmentally friendly work spaces and working practices, and making sure that we reduce unnecessary travel and we support people to work from home and remotely wherever possible. So I think that's a real push. There was a flexible working task force was held yesterday, which CIPD co-chairs, and I think that there is a real opportunity to make sure that there is not this sort of push to return to normal ways of working as we move forward over the next 6 to 12 months, and that should be absolutely tied into the opportunities around raising the importance of this agenda at this point.
All right. Well, look, let me just pick up. And Chris,
I'd like to come in, Nick. Can I just want to make one on the strategic perspective. I think there's a real issue around business models and the investment in green technology, because so IPPR North published a report just before Christmas, which was looking at decarbonisation in the housing profession, and they were making the point that if you're looking to, you've got to, for example, we need to replace heating systems with much more environmentally friendly heat pumps, but there isn't the skill base in order to do that. So HR needs to be feeding into those discussions around how can we make changes to our business model based on new technology, which fundamentally makes us more environmentally friendly businesses and helps to decarbonize our activities. And that is about industrial strategy at a national and local level. And I think that absolutely needs to be built into this agenda going forward. But as you know, Ben, the government has abolished the industrial strategy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So let me ask about another way of approaching this. So many companies increasingly are declaring net zero, and more and more will do so. That's Mark Carney is saying that all major companies need to do so by November and COP26. Are there opportunities from those companies who have made these big declarations, and they now need to actually put some words into action? Do those companies provide any sort of spearhead within the CIPD ecosystem for change?
I mean, potentially, and I think this is something that the reason I'm on the call is because we recognise that CIPD as the professional body for HR and people development needs to take a leadership role in this, and it might be working with some of those companies that you mentioned is the opportunity to do that, and it might be that their HR leaders that are really thinking about this from a strategic perspective, as well as a sort of tactical perspective, and it'd be really good to understand how that's happening, and then we know that examples, case studies are almost the most persuasive way of helping HR and other business leaders to think about change. So I think that would be really useful.
I wonder if I could come in on two quick points. So just on that discussion, I'd heartily recommend a publication from ARUP, the kind of global engineering consultancy, called "You've Declared a Climate Emergency," or words to that effect. It was aimed at local authorities and not businesses, but it was doing pretty much exactly what Ben was calling for. It allowed that it was aimed at giving local authorities some practical advice on what they could do next. And I guess partly what they were trying to do was acknowledging that the scale of the challenge and that you will need some strategic planning. But in the interim, it doesn't mean you can't begin. And here are some things you can start to make progress with now. They're going to be low regrets, no regrets that you can build on. And that's the kind of thing that we'd like to do more of with our members. ARUP, one of the strategic partners. I think just something that occurred to me. Another thing that quickly occurred to me while Ben was talking was, perhaps a role for CAFA is, just allowing us to kind of talk and understand at a kind of macro level the implications of what's happening in each other's sectors. Because while you were talking about homeworking, I was thinking about some of the work we're trying to do to get our heads around the implications of homeworking. Because on the face of it, it feels like it ought to be a positive in the transportation sector, but there's some indication that what's happening is that you replace a daily long commute with multiple short journeys, often by car in the locality, because people tootle down to the shops a bit more often. The car's at home, so the kids can use it, and there's some sort of emerging evidence suggesting that these two things are kind of displacing each other a little bit. We don't know yet. But it's just that kind of thing of being able to talk with each other, understanding what our priorities are in our sector, and just exploring how they might impact on what we're trying to do in our world. Because these things are interconnected in ways we don't always imagine.
Absolutely, I think that we need to make these connections, and this needs to be a systems approach to how change is taken forward.
Francesca.
Well, I was just going to come in and say exactly that. We've really got what we're calling a kind of scope 3 challenge here. You mentioned that we went carbon neutral last year. We believe we were the first major professional body to do so. We did it on a baseline of a kind of staff survey that we estimated our travel to and from our major offices back in February in 2020. Thank goodness we did, so that we actually got a decent baseline before everything went a bit weird. But now we estimate that our emissions as a result have dropped around 2/3. So that we know they haven't dropped 2/3. We just know that they would have dropped 2/3 associated with staff travel in a typical year. But I'm sitting here in the coldest April we've had for a long time, and I know that I'm running a gas-fired boiler and heating my home, and colleagues around the UK will be doing the same. So that challenge of, we've accounted for the emissions associated with travel in a typical environment. The UK has a massive challenge around heating of homes. We can't always focus on kind of office infrastructure in our estates as the primary place in where our people will work. So how do we actually engage with our colleagues around that? And this is a challenge which we've been, having conversations with our HR team, because equally we don't want to kind of, stomp into a conversation and tell people how to live their lives in their homes. But how does an employer have that conversation and ensure that they are not causing, unnecessary carbon emissions associated with the employees working at home? What does it look like in a hybrid scenario? We don't know. I don't think anyone particularly knows what the typical hybrid piece will be post COVID when we do return to some sort of workplace. And indeed, the City of London is announcing that it's going to be building homes and converting some of the offices, which is quite interesting.
1,500.
Yeah.
Chris. Francesca, do you have any advice for Ben Because one doesn't think of accountants as a radical profession, but you have made, groundbreaking changes. How does one do that process of persuasion across the 6 generations? Are there any lessons, do you think, that you could share?
So we've brought in key external kind of agitators, shall we say, because we have an integrated approach. We go in and figure out who are the leaders in particular sectors, whether it's working with our estates team or whether it's working with our human resources colleagues. And what was particularly interesting and how we came about with the Are You Professionally Ready piece was because we brought the finance director from Extinction Rebellion into a committee meeting of ours. We were deciding, should we declare an emergency? It seemed like the fashionable thing. But actually, we asked the question, well, what does rebellion mean for ICAEW? And that was a real agitator for change, because rather than thinking of what should we sign up for, and there's the kind of the net zero challenge with people signing up to things and then not really understanding them, is actually having a more intrinsic conversation, a question, well, what does this mean for me? TCFD did that quite successfully. It didn't ask, what do you contribute to climate change? It asked, what does it do to you as an organisation? Because for the longest time, sustainability meant people were running around talking about plastic-free canteens. In some of the major banks, I remember having a conversation where they were very proud to say they had a plastic-free canteen. Now, this was one of the largest banks in the world. You say, well, what are you doing around the banking side? Yeah. That's actually the challenge, is making it, what does it mean for you as an organisation? Now, because we rely on recruiting a younger generation of person to come in and join our profession and be part of that profession throughout their career, we always have that mindset in place. And so for us, it's about joining the dots to make sure that the conversations we're having with our future professionals is the same with our future staff members. So
can I pick up on this? I mean, you're famous for what you do on education, and you've got now a Green Finance Education Charter. Thinking of Ben's dilemmas, if I can call it that, learning and development is going to be a critical field. Are there any lessons from how you've developed your curriculum in terms of the green focus that could be applicable to other associations?
So that was a group of associations that came together, mostly in the finance profession, and we shared our sort of, where do we start with on sustainability? What are the resources that we already have in our qualifications? So TCFD, the UN Sustainable Development Goals for us, and various bits and pieces over the years relating to kind of accounting standards. But we sort of put those on the table, but said, well, what is an interdisciplinary approach here? Because there won't just be a sustainability professional singular. There'll be many professionals who have elements of sustainability in what they do. And so for us, it's about understanding that landscape of who are members, as they might be a finance director in a business, who is it they will be relying on? And actually opening up that conversation rather than being seen as being the only discipline that can then respond to this challenge. We recognise that you have to work together.
Francesca, can I ask a question? Do you have? I'm just interested in how much traction you have with your senior, finance directors, chief finance officers on, taking leadership positions on sustainability or decarbonisation.
Not a huge amount of kind of pushback. We've had a lot of support, particularly from members in those businesses that are perhaps regulated to do this. We've seen an increased amount of pressure, particularly on FTSE 100, FTSE 350 businesses. The challenge for us is that kind of SME market and the small and medium-sized practitioners. So everyone thinks of the big four, but actually we have 15,000 member firms, and it's about making it relevant for them and the clients that they advise. They will be seeing it coming through in different pressures. It will be through supply chain, it will be cost of capital, it will be cost of insurance rising, it might be a flood risk for an office. Those are the challenges that we have to then articulate the climate through. It's not about rushing into a finance director's office and saying there's a climate emergency, because they'll say, well, I've just tackled the homeschooling emergency and then I'm dealing with cash flow right now. It's pretty ridiculous of us to come in and add climate to that list. So it's asking, well, what are you worrying about, and how does climate potentially have a strategic lens by which you can view that?
Yeah.
Could I ask Francesca? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to ask Francesca.
Maybe I can ask Ali to jump in a moment. Are we moving in the right direction to understand what CAFA can be doing? Andrew.
I was just going to ask Francesca, just so I understand really. So have you managed to kind of reach a kind of shared curriculum across some of the financial institutions? Because this is a challenge for us as well, because we've got a foot in construction and a foot in engineering, and we're having conversations with our kind of fellow institutions about how we kind of get something that's joined up.
Yeah, so with with the Green Finance Education Charter, which was mentioned, this was an approach which was led on by the Green Finance strategy that was set out in the industrial strategy a couple of years ago. And we've actually had a really good, I've got a meeting with the group this afternoon, we've had a really wonderful relationship that's developed between the bodies, because it's not just about integrating into the curriculum. Whilst that's a wonderful thing, we're educating, people are typically in their early 20s and late teens. They're not going to be in decision-making positions for a longer time. And so that's not going to tackle the climate crisis. But that said, it's then created a space in which we can come together and put events together, think through CPD challenges, think through the way in which we will be offering this to change that mindset of the mainstream members who are already qualified. And that's been particularly useful, actually, is that kind of collaborative place in which we've come together.
Francesca, if I heard you correctly, late teens, early 20s not having influence yet. I'd put to you that actually what you're seeing in many areas is a real influence coming from the 20s and 30s. So that would be almost a miscalculation by organisations.
Yeah, and perhaps I misspoke. I didn't mean to say that they have no influence, because most recently we've seen huge influence of that generation in the workforce. What I mean is perhaps in kind of more conservative organisations where it is still a kind of top-down approach. So far. But
that could be
it has to be done across the professions, so that.
But that could be a shock for some organisations, not realising that there's a voice coming from lower down.
Yeah, I'm actually speaking at our employer conference later in May, because employers are seeing that unless they have this as a hygiene factor in their kind of offering for young professionals, they're not seeing the talent wanting to join their workforce or stay if they're already there.
Ali, do you want to come in and just tell us if we're moving in the right direction for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Really fascinating conversation. I guess what I'm hearing really strongly is this massive, focus on skills and ensuring the skills are in place and the challenges that that exist around that at all levels. So making sure that, obviously right skills, right talent, right people in the right jobs. But Ben, there's a massive role for the CIPD, obviously, in this agenda, perhaps working, like you said, integrating the whole sustainability piece into business modeling and the required change in organizations' business models to achieve net zero isn't just about setting the targets and implementing tangible mechanical changes. It's around ensuring that the skills are in place to deliver the change. And it struck me as well, Francesca, when you were talking about the process that you went through around I think it was your baseline setting, your own organization, and obviously you went straight to scope 3, and that you were calculating how many employees you have, how much travel they're undertaking, what they're consuming, what their sort of protocols were in terms of operating. And again, HR people professionals sit at the heart of that, because I would imagine that to collect that data, you were involving your HR team quite closely in terms of data and analytics. So I think, again, there's a skills piece, Ben, I think, in terms of the people profession, and that what is their role tactically as well in working within their organization to help.
Yeah. Where I would start, if I was an HR leader, where I'd start on this agenda is workforce planning. And this, the environment would be a massive part of a PESEL analysis that you do up front. And then you think about the technology that would, the game-changing technology that the business needs to invest in to fundamentally change its business model. And then you think about the skills required to ensure that as a business you can recruit and develop the talent you need to fulfill that business model. And so from a strategic perspective, that's where I'd start. I think workforce planning is the tool that HR leaders, when they're involved in it, they use to understand how HR strategy intersects with business strategy and the wider strategic agenda of the organization. So I think that's something which I think the other thing for us, we need to make sure that within the profession map, to I think Chris's point about how embedding the curriculum. So Andrew's point, I think it was embedding this in the curriculum, and seeing it as a key attraction, a key way of attracting people into the profession, because they can make a material change, because HR potentially, can be really influential. So I think there's lots of thinking that we need to do to make sure that this is integrated into the heart of the profession map and our qualifications.
Sorry, Francesca.
Well, just based on what Ben was saying and what's worked for us, when we started on this journey around sustainability, and we've engaged our staff at ICAEW and our membership for many years now, we actually ran films using WWF's really powerful film, Our Planet, Our Business, and used the sustainability conversation as an engagement piece, an opportunity to say, if you look across the UN Sustainable Development Goals, what is the role that ICAEW plays, and allowing staff and members to articulate that. Because that gives them ownership over it. It's not around us knowing what the answers are and telling you what to do. Sustainability is about engaging people so that they feel motivated. It's about bringing that personal passion into their professional context. So don't underestimate the ability for this to engage with people. That's been really useful for us. So when it came to this time last year, when we were asking the board to sign off on our carbon neutrality strategy, it sailed through, and it was because we developed and fostered a workplace culture where people were engaged around this topic. It wasn't something that an expert in the department was telling you to do. It was very much part of the bread and butter. And that's been really powerful for us.
Francesca, could it be that one word which comes from there, and maybe I'm going too far, is almost a liberation? That what you've done is managed to liberate people who were thinking in a certain way but weren't sure if they dare say it. I'm probably being too crude here, but has it acted as a kind of ventilator?
Yeah, definitely. From conversations like we've recently pushed all of our training materials online. A typical chartered accountant, when they do their training, they will be able to stand next to a huge pile of learning resources, which we put them through our exam processes already. But that said, we pushed all of that online, but equally we're now having a conversation with our learning and professional development colleagues to say, well, what would a carbon neutral or a net zero qualification be? How can we have a conversation with other professional bodies to say, well, what would that mean for you? So that those kind of aspirations, we're always moving forward. It's not about a kind of a hygiene factor, because frankly, net zero by 2050 is a hygiene factor. It's kind of, we have to be there because the UK has decided that. But it's about asking, well, what's the next question? Not just what are the initiatives I can sign up to now.
Andrew, do you want to come in? Oh, Ben, please.
I was just thinking, something which I was just thinking in terms of bringing multi-stakeholders together in a sort of integrated learning package, something just a sort of tactical intervention in the relatively short term. But we've developed a number of MOOCs on FutureLearn, which have proved. I think we've had something like nearly 80,000 learners. They're free online training courses, typically about 6 weeks long, 5 hours of learning a week. And I was thinking there might be something that CAFA you could do with some sponsorship. They cost about sort of 40 to 60,000 to develop, but the traction you get is brilliant, and from learners, and they give you a sort of entry point into a topic, and it might be something that we could do collaboratively, to help understand how the different stakeholders, how you address this issue strategically and tactically from an organizational perspective. But so I was just thinking about things that can be done to bring that sort of multi-stakeholder perspective into understanding how to make change meaningful.
Ben, I'm just thinking of the language here. You talk about learning. Is it really learning, or is it engagement? Is it something more now? It's not just about I'm sitting here learning how to do something. It's about actually engaging, and I come back to that word of those two words, liberating and ventilating, applying what they are thinking already and making it feel much more comfortable.
I think it's both, probably, but I still think there's a need to really articulate. So, for example, if you're an HR leader, and you're talking to your finance colleagues, what's the starting point on this? Because I think within organisations, it's going to be, and I mean, Francesca, maybe I'm about to be unfair to. I'm just going to pick on the accountants, but I mean, HR is just as culpable. But quite often, there is a real short-term perspective on value creation within organisations, and for example, businesses too often will see the workforce as a cost to be managed rather than something to be invested in that drives value. And I think it's those conversations around, how do we have a longer term perspective on value creation, and of course, decarbonisation and the environment needs to be at the heart of those conversations. But that conversation will change depending on the organisation, the sector it works in, and the personalities and the priorities of the people on executive leadership teams and boards.
Okay.
So I think
I was going to come in. I just think that's pretty. That does sound quite appealing and a good role for CAFA, because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, look, there's clearly some sort of sector-specific carbon literacy stuff that we need to kind of roll out into our basic competency. There are things that apply to highways engineers or transport planners that are sector-specific, but beyond that, there's quite a lot in the topics we've been discussing around strategic leadership, workforce planning, evolving your business model, and I think being able to do that on some kind of cross-disciplinary basis and some strategic basis through CAFA does sound quite appealing, just as a kind of basic proposition.
Ali, we've got 10 minutes left. Do you want to lay down a challenge for where you'd like to get to in the next 10 minutes?
No, I mean, I think what you've just described there is the ultimate ambition of CAFA. It's obviously to bring together systems and sectors and professions in order to accelerate to net zero. So by creating a world where we can bring institutes and associations together to not only learn from one another, but to actually create a practical set of tools and skills development, so as to do exactly what Nick's just said, to take action rather than just to continue talking about it, is the ultimate aim. So I'm really interested, Andrew, you touched on really early in the call, I'm just going to steer away from skills just one second, about the new norm and the new, I guess, the transport and the impact that the air, for instance, air quality, it has obviously improved as a result of less commuting. Well, it has in the UK anyway. There's obviously very clear evidence to suggest that. Can we talk about well-being for a minute, because I think obviously ultimately that's one of the greatest outcomes in terms of driving social and human quality of life as a result of achieving net zero. Can we just have a bit of a very quick conversation on everyone's viewpoints about well-being, and then we can start to wrap up the conversation.
Andrew,
this is an area I'm particularly keen to learn more about.
Yeah, well, I wonder if it touches on a couple of things Francesca was saying about, you mentioned the kind of 6 capitals model. We've got a 5 capitals model in construction for some reason. I'm not quite sure why we got 5 and not 6, but there you go, that's life. But also, I think, and also about just thinking about how you can use sustainability as a lens to think about other priorities. So yes, certainly in the transportation space, that kind of well-being, quality of life agenda is often a better way in to a sustainability debate, a net zero debate, certainly at the local level, than appealing solely to a climate crisis that, frankly, for some people can seem a little bit abstract and distant. So things like air, and it also opens up a conversation about not simply introducing a tech fix. So in engineering, there's a danger in the transport space that you just say, well, we're going to electrify the vehicles fleet and job done. That does nothing for congestion. Actually, doesn't help that in air quality that much, because part of the problem is about the particulates that come from the tyre, from wear and tear of tyres on the road surface. So if you can kind of present if you can present the net zero challenge as integrated with a kind of wider piece around the kind of quality of your life, the quality of your children's life, opportunity, etc., that's clearly a good thing. Now, I don't have an answer to how you do that, but as a kind of strategic play, it's clearly got legs.
Francesco,
in my opinion,
there's a huge amount underway in the space around evolving accounting standards so they take better account of the multi-capital accounting frameworks and so on. I don't think we're there yet. We don't measure what we treasure, we measure what we can measure. And there's a challenge for accountants, I think, to evolve beyond that, get to the stage where you can actually think through, well, what values that my organisation represents, and what are we valuing in the processes and the products and the services that we provide. You've seen a lot of companies recently go on these journeys around purpose. What is it that they do? I mentioned that earlier, this idea of, what is it that you do and how does sustainability relate to it? Because I think the real challenge that we're seeing is organisations putting sustainability a box over here rather than seeing as integral to the business. And that's where the staff engagement comes in, because if you are, saying that you're a carbon neutral organisation and just telling the staff about it without actually engaging them first, it's meaningless to them. You've got to recognise that often there will be environmental and social dimensions to every challenge, and they won't necessarily be equal. There will be, challenges around, well, we need to have people coming in to and from the office, and they may need to drive. We've got an office in Milton Keynes. Of course, people need to drive because there's barely any public transport there. But recognising that there's that multifaceted challenge and kind of being upfront about it is what I'd argue is important, particularly when it comes to wellbeing. That's why we've actually worked with Human Resources to make sure that we are sensitively approaching this year's measurements around our carbon neutrality. We haven't gone to all staff because we recognise that all staff, most of whom haven't been to the office this year, so the baseline for them is zero. But equally, in the coming years, we'll be looking to measure, well, what is a good balance for you coming to and from the office, and what does that have an implication on not just of our carbon, but also of your well-being and your ability to do your job and the ability for the organisation to perform. We're being upfront about all of that balance.
Ben, do you want to come in at all on that? And Chris, do you want to? Is there a big takeaway we can already see? Do you think, Chris? Let's go to Ben, but I'll give you a minute's notice on that.
Just quickly on the well-being issue. I mean, I think on the broader perspective around well-being, making our world a sustainable place to live. I think the problem around, the challenge around well-being is that in the most people are focused on their immediate environment and the factors that affect their immediate well-being. So you're looking at things like stress or debt, or whether they're being bullied at work, or whether they've got a relationship problem, or if they've suffered a bereavement. I mean, those I think it's those things which are the people's immediate triggers around their emotional well-being or their mental health. But I think this is if you ask people to step back and think longer term about their well-being, that's when and their family, that's when this will really land. So I think it's how you talk about well-being and in what context, probably.
Chris.
And I would argue from work we've done, Ben, it's also looking at the design of jobs and incentives, for example, to do with people when they suffer burnout. I mean, that's a crucial part of that whole well-being equation. And Nick sent me a sort of challenge to sort of summarize. I'm not going to summarize, but what I want to encourage is, given how thoughtful all of you are in your work and in this conversation today, the more that you can collaborate as the sort of advanced guard of thinking in your institutions, which are so critical, as I said at the start, will be really critical. So I encourage you to share emails and numbers, as well as obviously engaging through the work that Ali has described that CAFA will do, because we're only going to reach any of these targets if we all collaborate and engage, and we'll make mistakes. We have to learn from the mistakes. And if you can learn from peers in another field, that's probably a very helpful way of doing it. And obviously learning the successes. Nick and I focus a great deal on case studies, things that had gone well. But we always say, unlike a Harvard case study, listen to the blood, sweat and tears that led to the success, not just the idea it's some effortless process as written in hindsight. So I encourage you to engage, not just now, but in the future, and share some of those points of how we can all take this agenda forward.
And I've written down three phrases here, two of which I'm intrigued by: sludge and valley of death. I'm not quite sure how that transfers between all your professions, but also what Francesca said about key external agitators. Do you want to tell us in literally a short time, Francesca, what you really mean by that? Because what it shows is that actually sometimes, and quite often, the people inside an organization are too narrow to be able to see what really is needed. And you use the word agitator here.
Yeah, I think it comes from, a wide variety of projects that we've run at ICAEW over the years to go and look for some unlikely voices and give them space in the conversations. So, for example, one of the projects we started was called the Finance Innovation Lab. It was started in the last financial crisis, and we partnered with it with WWF. That relationship that we've had for a number of years now has been really useful because it's not a usual suspect's voice for us. You know, we could very easily go to one of the big four or one of the industry regulators and have a conversation about what the future of the profession means. But actually, it's often about looking outside the profession, you know, to say, well, what do you expect of us? Giving the issues a voice, which often the NGO community do. But equally recognizing that, you know, the power that Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes for climate have had is because they are social movements. You know, these things don't exist in a vacuum. In the same way that the Black Lives Matter movement was so powerful last year at forcing organisations to have a conversation about inclusion and diversity. So it's recognising that not all of the answers will be sourced within and reaching out to those organisations and movements that are cutting through and engaging with the views of what people want. You know, that's why we've used the SDGs as a way to articulate what sustainability means and going and seeking out people to work with on the variety of issues that are represented there.
I picked up because it's certainly something that Chris and I have been doing with several organizations. And you can feel a kind of tension at the beginning, but there's almost a relief that someone is saying what actually those around the table are privately thinking, but don't really want to say it.
That you can take away is that collaboration is the art of constructive disagreement. That is an important thing to recognise, because if you sit around in groups where you're just constantly agreeing with each other, you're not getting anywhere. You need to invite those dissonant voices in so that they can agitate, you to act.
Can I throw in something sort of slightly more negative on this? Sorry to kind of end on a negative note, but I've been ploughing through some of the kind of previous material that CIHT had produced, and a few years back there was a kind of big future of the profession piece, the kind of thing that professional institutions habitually do. And it seemed that one of the kind of strong messages coming through from that was that I think the word that was used was kind of professional impotence, as a sense that people knew exactly what the right thing to do was, be it in terms of social value or the transition to net zero, but they just didn't feel they had the ability to make that change within the kind of structures of their organisation or within the kind of habitual processes of their sector. I suppose this is what I meant by the valley of death piece. I think that's a huge challenge, and it's what I think it's one we can probably all recognise as well.
All right. Well, look,
Andrew, on that, I was on a webinar with some very thoughtful young activists in Birmingham yesterday, and they used the phrase dark matter. You like metaphors. And what they argue is you need to do systems analysis, work out what are the things that make up dark matter. Some are obvious, some are not so obvious. So you can really work through how to achieve that process of change. Nick, you have one last quote as well, don't you?
I'm really reluctant to bring this to a close, but I think we ought to keep to the time discipline. We said 58 minutes ago. So, Ali, why don't you just wind up? I'm very struck by the number of times all of you have said that CAFA could play a very important role here in just joining together and sharing of information, sharing of experiences, sharing what does work, what doesn't work, how you can fail and experiment safely. Ali.
Yeah, as always, I think this conversation we could have on going. I think it's been really interesting and useful, and thank you for all your suggestions as well. We'll be in touch, and I think this conversation that we're having today hasn't come to a close. I feel like we need to probably schedule another one and look at some real practical actions as a result of this. So I thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful as always, Nick and Chris. Thanks for taking time out this morning. I know how busy you all are. Really appreciate it.
Sorry, there's no fruit juice and coffee and tea and croissant, but maybe one day we can do that.
One day.
Yeah, without traveling anywhere, Andrew. The virtual croissant, or the virtual fruit salad. Thank you all very much.
Get on your bike, Nick.
Crack that.
Lovely to meet you all. And Ben, thanks for joining us as well, even if it was a moment late.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, but I hope you picked up. Okay.
Enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.